This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, May 31st. I'm Marianne Azevedo, and joining me today is TC reporter Haya Camps. Haya, how's your week been?
You know, I've had a wild couple of weeks, and this week I'm doing a really dumb thing, which is trying to cram about 6 days worth of work into about 3 days. Monday was Memorial Day. Tuesday, I accidentally ended up doing 11 calls back to back.
Oh my goodness, that's nuts.
Wednesday, my brain was cooked. But, you know, I've got a fun weekend ahead, and I'm excited about that. So it's all right.
Wow, 11. That has to be like a record. That's crazy. Also joining us today is senior TC reporter on the Venture Beat and co-host of our sister podcast, Found, Becca Skutak. Becca, what's new in your world? How are you?
I am doing well. I always say I love a 3-day weekend, but I hate a 4-day week.
Yeah.
So trying to definitely cram a bit as well, but I don't think I'm trying to cram as much as Haya. So I think I'm doing a little better.
I know that we always kind of pay for those extra days that we get, right? When it's a holiday, it's like having to do twice the amount of work in the days leading up and after. But hey, can't complain. So, well, before we get to the show rundown, please don't forget to rate and review Equity on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your preferred pod streamer is. We'd really appreciate it. Now, on the show today, we've got a few exciting deals of the week. They're all a little bit different, but cool in their own ways. We'll be talking about XAI, WeatherXM, and solutions by text. Lots of X's there. Didn't realize that. Then we'll head into discussing the debacle at fintech Synapse, which is basically a big mess that's ongoing. So we'll dig into that a bit. And then we'll jump into the startups that are definitely or definitely not going to go public this year. So, Haya, I know you have lots of thoughts about XAI. Fill us in.
So look, Elon Musk is a really interesting human being. And, you know, there's a reason why there's an old Chinese curse that is, may you live in interesting times. The fact that he's able to raise $6 billion for an AI startup from, you know, Valor, A16Z, and Sequoia, I just don't get it. He's got such an incredible track record of, he's like the buy now, pay later of morals, as far as I can tell. And it's not worked out super well for X, which used to be called Twitter. It's not worked out super well for a bunch of his other companies, right? You can say what you will about Tesla's valuation, but by every measure, it is incredibly overvalued as far as I could tell. And letting him near AI, I don't love it. I really don't love it.
I mean, he is a co-founder of OpenAI, which, you know, I'm not sure if everybody knows that, but he invested like tens of millions of dollars in it. But apparently, you know, he's kind of, obviously, he's backed off of that if he's building a competitor. And he sued the company, actually, and its co-founder, Sam Altman, for allegedly betraying its mission statement and becoming a closed source, quotes, closed source de facto subsidiary of Microsoft. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, I wasn't shocked that he was able to raise this kind of money because investors just seem to keep pouring it on. They keep writing him checks no matter what happens, no matter what he does, no matter how poorly some of his other companies seem to be performing. They seem to have no problem to continue to write him checks. And I know when we talked about this before the show, Haya, you said it pissed you off. And it is kind of infuriating. Like, really, $6 billion is a lot of money, pre-money valuation of $18 billion. It's like, okay, how many startups out there with viable business models, traction that can barely raise a few $1 million, if anything? And, you know, it's just namely because of his name or who he is that he's able to command this sort of valuation and funding. And that's just really frustrating.
Yeah. And I know when I saw this, was I surprised Elon Musk was going to make a play in the AI space or make his own company? No. Was I surprised he was going to be able to raise a lot of money for it? Unfortunately, no. What I was surprised about is just who he raised from, because there's so much overlap with the Twitter investors, which is interesting to me because it's like, sure, if these were SpaceX investors who were like, cool, we keep seeing our investment go up, 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 like we're going to back something else of his, great. But Twitter isn't that. So it was interesting to see that like a lot of the same investors like Sequoia and Andreessen who helped him buy Twitter when Twitter's not, or X, sorry, of course, is not really doing that well. It's not doing as poorly as it was, but it's still not, I wouldn't say like the kind of investment you'd want to like tell everyone you were a part of. So seeing those exact same names come into this round, and I know Dan Primack over at Axios did some reporting that says like there's no ties between these equity stakes either. So it's not like that's why it's the same names participating. That really surprised me.
Yeah. I guess that Elon Musk's superpower is like coming up with systems design, right? So for SpaceX, it wasn't that it was a rocket company. It was like, hey, we have to create a whole new system in order to take a rocket, land it, and then be able to reuse it, which drastically reduces the price of sending rockets into space. Like on the surface of it, that makes an awful lot of sense. I appreciate that, right? But I know that CEOs running companies generally have to spend all their focus on one thing, right? And I've lost track of how many companies Musk is the CEO of now.
Yeah,
and you have to
real.
wonder, like maybe it's a blessing that he's not able to be effective because it seems like the companies do better when he's not paying attention to them. But there's this crazy thing, right? And I mean, I guess this is why I'm a podcast host and not a VC, because I wouldn't place that bet. It just doesn't make sense to me at all in any world.
Yeah, it's a good point. And also, I mean, him just trying to compete with OpenAI, Microsoft, Alphabet, potentially Apple, which is trying to ramp up its AI efforts. I just have to wonder, like, it feels like he would be pretty behind. Or, I mean, am I wrong? I mean, it seems like he's behind. Like, how is he going to catch up to them? I mean, how exactly is this going to work?
He's going to build it the same way he's built all those really well-working X features that we all now use in our daily lives because they work so well.
Totally. And similarly, it seems like, these SpaceX rockets occasionally explode. You kind of go like, I get it. You have to be disruptive to make things happen.
For sure.
But I'm also like, I don't know, maybe not in the AI space, but...
Yeah, I know we have to move on. I mean, the last thing I would like to share on this, I appreciate his being bold. I appreciate his trying to be visionary, but at some point you kind of have to just realize your limitations. But anyway, we're going to move on to my deal of the week, which is a company with maybe not the most exciting name in the world, but it's called Solutions by Text. And it caught my eye, though, because I love these stories. It was bootstrapped for over a decade, actually about 13 years before they raised their first outside capital. And they just recently secured about $110 million in funding. Let me be clear that not all of that was equity. There was some debt, less than 15% was debt, but still a pretty significant raise, a mix of primary and secondary shares. And what they're doing is very cool. It's giving people a way to pay their bills or do things like apply for loans via text messaging. And, the premise behind it is that more and more people want this option, and that text is a easier and better way to get people's attention than email, for example, because like the CEO pointed out, I have like 4 unread text messages right now, but like 1,000 unread emails. And I mean, I do too. I could see that. So it's kind of easier to get people's attention right now through text. And they also claim that they're super compliant, which, I have to be skeptical anytime anybody says that these days, but their track record so far seems to be backing that up, so that more and more companies like eBay, for example, as a customer, are using them for these sort of capabilities. So it was a little different, interesting, based out of Dallas, bootstrapped for a long time, growing a lot, just interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know there's some people who are like one touch or whatever that term is, where it's like they learn that they need to do something or they hear that they need to do something and they like do it right away. And I have long wished I was more of a one-touch person. And one area I'm particularly trying to be a one-touch person in is bills, especially the bills you do not get regularly, like not like your monthly, whatever, electric bill and stuff like that, but like random medical bills from like a blood test, like things like that. Like I have tried to be more one-touch with them. And I love this idea because if they texted me the bill and I could pay it via the text, like I could fulfill my one-touch dreams finally.
Right.
I love that. The thing that completely screws with my mind is all the companies that get built in this country that are just like patching over a broken banking system. Like this type of thing. Like whenever I read about companies like this existing, I'm like, go you for raising $110 million. But in functioning economies where they have a functioning banking system, this kind of thing, just one-touch billing, in much of Europe, your bills just show up in your bank account and you click pay.
Oh, interesting.
Or dispute or automatic pay. And every time a bill arrives, it just pays it. I'm like,
wow,
how long are we going to continue patching this over? And the crazy thing is, Like PayPal was founded so long ago to solve this problem and failed, right? We're still exactly where we were. And I'm like, can we just not? Anyway, congratulations for raising the money, but it's just such an abomination that we need this.
No, I agree. It feels like we're still very behind when it comes to a lot of things in finance. I mean, like I've talked about before, and not to digress too much, but like in Brazil, they have Pix, and people even use Pix on the street to pay vendors, things like that. I mean, we don't even have that sort of thing here in the US. I feel like we're just really, really behind in a lot of ways, but maybe that's exactly why this company seems to be growing and doing pretty well. They said that their revenue has increased by more than 3x since late 2021 when they first raised their capital, and that their, I can never say this, EBITDA positive, nearing profitability. So, hey, we'll watch out for them to see how they're doing, say, in the next year or so. I'd like to see if they're continuing this growth momentum. But now, Becca, I'm also very curious now to jump into your deal of the week, because I've read this story about twice trying to fully grasp it because it was so unique. Can you fill us in?
Yeah. And now, before I do that, I will admit I am the first one to think that Web3 is a little silly. I'm kind of a Web3 hater. I always kind of have been. So when I saw this company announce their deal, that it's called WeatherXM, they raised a $7.7 million Series A round led by Faction, which is a blockchain-focused fund affiliated with Lightspeed. I was like, what the heck is this? Like, why do we need Web3 and weather? Like, I was like, I truly just like don't get this. So I was like, obviously I'm curious. So I reached out and talked to them and ended up finding that this was just really fascinating. And maybe like, I'm so sorry for all the listeners who this will make mad. This may be the first Web3 case I actually was like, I actually get it this time. But the company is essentially making a network. They build their own small weather stations that can collect like local ground weather data. And they're having people monitor these weather stations, sign up to keep track of them, sign up to maintain them, and they're using it to collect this local weather data in a quest to make weather forecasts more accurate. The founders are super interesting. This is actually the third weather-related project they've started. They've been trying to fix this issue for a while, and this one kind of combines what they've been doing for their last two. So all the weather data they collect is open source. Anyone can access it for free. If you want to use it in a commercial setting, they have subscription models. But the reason why this is sort of in the Web3 blockchain space is one, that open source piece, but two, they created their own crypto token that they use to pay the people who monitor the weather stations, which I was like, well, why wouldn't you just pay them regular money or in their local currency? And they're saying because they work with people in so many different countries already, over 80 countries, and they're just getting started, it would be really costly, really complicated, really tough compliance-wise to pay them. And they also found out from their first weather project that people will do this for free. So they just added that part in to kind of give a little more incentive to kind of hope to get more people interested, because their first project was developing a local ground weather focused app, and they had over 10,000 people submitting data for free.
That's great.
So they're like trying to build this community weather data approach, which I think this stuff is so interesting because the market for this seems real. I know in their prior company where they were doing like weather consulting to try to get more accurate data for like weather sensitive industries, they're working with like the Athens airport in Greece. Like they're working with like big name people because it seems like everyone wants more accurate weather data. And this is just such a funky way to try to do it. I just thought this was so interesting.
I agree. And I'm with you on the being a blockchain doubter. But this also reminds me of the Helium Mobile project, right? Which is basically you hook up this thing to your internet connection, and it then does an extension of mobile networks in coverage where there isn't a lot of mobile networks. So this can be like LoRaWAN for like IoT devices. Like imagine you have like trackers or something. Instead of having to use the cell network, you can use this distributed network. And they use tokens to pay users to put up these cells. So in theory, look, there's a higher incentive for putting a cell in an area that has low coverage.
Right.
And in that universe, I'm like, actually, blockchains kind of make sense here. And I'm glad to hear of this weather-based solution that's kind of in the same vein. I was surprised by myself, but I'm being won around. I was like, oh, cool, look, a use case that makes sense.
Yeah, and not only that, I really love that they seem to be genuinely concerned about, their mission. It's not like, oh, we just want to make money. I mean, they're making this available to some people for free. They're trying to make it easier for people to report the data. So I think they're very serious about trying to help prevent, as you write, Becca, prevent and mitigate harm from inclement weather events or natural disasters. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, there's so many people who have lost so much due to a disaster that maybe could have been prevented. So I feel like their mission is super authentic. And that also spoke to me. So also being sort of a, I don't want to say again, blockchain skeptic, but not someone who's super bullish on it all. I do agree that this all kind of makes sense. It all fits together. It's unique. It's different. Is the company based in Greece, Becca?
So I believe they're based in Switzerland, actually.
Oh.
I think they're headquartered in Switzerland, but I think the majority of the folks are in Greece still. But when I was talking to them about this and things started to click, it made me think I did a project. This was like fall of 2022 on our Yahoo for Good Day, where you were helping the Red Cross map rural areas in Africa. And you would look at like satellite images and point out where, if you saw settlements so that they could mark them better. And the reason people were doing that is for these inclement weather events, because when they happen in these rural areas, they don't know where people are. Humanitarian aid just straight up doesn't have a good grasp on where people are. Mapping is not super advanced over there and things like that. And this felt very connected to that in my mind, where I was like, if you're getting these weather stations in these rural areas, which the founders told me, like, those are the areas that they're super pushing for. They really want to get data in those areas that are often overlooked, that just don't have accurate information about them. And then it's like this whole ripple effect. There's no accurate information about an impending climate disaster. And then it happens. Then people can't find the people who live there. So it just seems like a very interesting way to start to fix some of those issues that really just do often get kind of overlooked.
Becca, kudos to you for always kind of uncovering these really neat and unique companies that are doing things that I've never heard of. So that's not easy in the startup world. So I really appreciate that. Well, next up, we're going to be talking about the Synapse debacle. But first, a break. So over the past few weeks, I've been covering a fintech or a banking as a service startup called Synapse. And it's super complicated and messy and an ongoing story. So I'll try my best to summarize as best as I can here before we get into a deep discussion. But essentially, the company started running into trouble last fall. It was laying off people. And then this year, things really started getting, I guess, worse. And they announced that they were filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but selling their assets to another company called TabaPay. That deal fell through. Lots of finger pointing was taking place between Synapse, its banking partner Evolve, and Mercury, the business banking startup Mercury. Just anyway, big mess. So yeah, once that deal fell through, Synapse is basically just falling apart, and a lot of fintechs and consumers are paying the price. I wrote about Copper, a teen digital bank last week that had to discontinue its bank operations abruptly. A lot of very unhappy customers are emailing me currently still about that. Another startup, Mainvest, had to shut down because of this mess. And it's really raising a lot of questions about banking as a service as a space, because it was once kind of the darling of the fintech space. But now a lot of people are kind of calling into question, hey, do we really want this middleman? And if so, we need a lot more compliance. We need a lot more regulations. And I just realized something. I don't think I really explained for our listeners who don't understand what banking as a service is. I'll say this and then shut up for a minute.
I was actually going to ask that as a question. Do you want me to do that?
Go ahead.
Hey, Marianne, I think I understand what it does, but could you remind me, what does Synapse do and why is it such a big deal to the companies that were relying on them?
Yeah, it is a good question because I'm so knee deep into all this. Sometimes I forget not everybody's going to understand banking as a service. So basically, Synapse operated a service that allowed others, mainly fintechs, to embed banking services into their offerings. For example, a software provider that specialized in payroll for 1099 contractor-heavy businesses used Synapse to provide an instant payment feature, or others used it to offer specialized credit or debit cards, like Copper, this team-focused fintech. Until last year, for example, it was providing those types of services as an intermediary between its banking partner, Evolve Bank and Trust, and business banking startup Mercury, until those two decided they wanted to work directly with each other and cut out Synapse as a middleman.
Marianne, from where you sit now, we've already seen some companies, of course, be negatively affected by Synapse shutting down. But where do you think we are in this process? Do you think we're right at the beginning of hearing of the issues that come out of this?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I do, unfortunately. I think it's probably worse than we all even realize. I think more stories are going to come out. There was funds at another fintech crypto app called Juno that were impacted. CNBC quoted a Maryland teacher who said that he was blocked from accessing his funds. I've gotten emails about people who had money in other startups. I'm going to do a follow-up on this, by the way, and I'll detail more of it. But I think it's just the beginning, which is really, really sad. Honestly, like, I think sometimes people just don't realize, like, how many companies, how many people can be impacted when just one player in this ecosystem fails. And this is a prime example of that. One of the things that I've talked about is not only is this going to maybe make people reluctant to work with fast players or fintech players in the future, it may also make it harder for these types of companies to raise money in the future, because this is just such a disaster. It's just going to be a huge turnoff. I get why people are upset. And we're talking about everyday people, not billionaires like Elon Musk. I mean, this is a lot of money to a lot of people. And a lot of these people have no clue if they're ever going to get their money back, much less when. So, I'm a fintech reporter. I think there's a lot of great things about fintech, but I'm not going to lie. This makes me even a little bit less eager to sign up and work with a fintech and hand them my money.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, when SVP collapsed, lots of other banks kind of leapt into the breach to kind of fill the void. Are we seeing that here? Like, is there anybody else who's like an obvious, when Synapse stops, switch to this? Or is there no like-for-like replacement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's definitely other players in the space who do claim that they're more compliant. Of course, Synctera, Unit, Treasury Prime. I feel like, though, it's not as easy in terms of like, okay, we're just going to switch accounts, right? Because there's still a lot of money unaccounted for. And, we don't know where all that money is or if people are going to get it back. So there are alternatives, I think, for people who still want to work with this sort of player or BaaS company. But I think for the people that have already been impacted like this, I don't think it's just as easy as like, okay, we're going to just move our accounts over. Another thing, really quickly, I had talked to one consultant who said that there has to be more clear language from the FDIC about what's covered with FDI insurance in a neobank that uses a third-party bank on the back end, because I think that's all still very hazy right now. Like, because one of the first questions is like, okay, was this money FDIC insured? There's still a lot of questions. So I feel like this reminds me a little bit of what happened in the crypto space. Like, regulation hasn't kept up. So people are scrambling, trying to understand what they're truly entitled to and what they're not. And last thing I'm going to say, I talked to a Gartner analyst who also said this case really underscores the need for fintech companies to maintain high operational and compliance standards. And as middleware providers, they must ensure accurate financial record keeping and transparent operations. So look, I'm not trying to bash fintech. I still think there's a lot of amazing fintech companies, the technology and all that out there. But it does upset me when there are players who aren't doing what they need to do or not being compliant enough. And then so many just innocent people get hurt. Now, I am not trying to necessarily say Synapse didn't do what it was supposed to do. I don't really know exactly all the details that led to its demise. But just in general, this sort of thing just makes me really, really sad.
Yeah. Well, the FDIC thing was really front of mind for me, but you kind of partially answered that. It feels like it's a little bit of a game of nesting dolls. It's like, who's left holding the bag at the end of this when the collapse happens, right? So if I have a banking relationship with Copper, or if my kid does, how would we even really know who Synapse is or like who the bank that they work with is? Like, I feel like if I have a banking relationship, that's the person I talk to. It feels like such a cop-out for them to be able to say, sorry, we have to shut down, but also we never had your money. That's actually a different service. I'd be like, dude, I signed a contract with you. It feels really opaque,
No, that's such a good point. And you bringing that up now instantly made me think of the Wall Street bet thing from a few years ago when everyone thought their money was safer because it was going through the apps and they didn't realize that like the same brokerage funds were like doing the transactions on the back end. It is really interesting to think about the fact that companies can go down and you as a consumer who tries your best to make smart financial decisions are going to end up being tied into things that you didn't even know are related.
Yeah. I mean, the average person isn't aware of these relationships behind the scenes. Exactly. Very, very good point, Haya.
Yeah. Well, and, a few years ago, I ended up getting a mortgage and we chose our mortgage provider. And then as soon as the mortgage payments and documents showed up, it was like a bank that I specifically didn't want to work with because they have a bunch of like investments that I disagree with. And I was like, come on, guys, I did my due diligence here and you've sold me the mortgage and immediately sold it to the bank I specifically didn't want to work with. Great. Thanks. But at least that is open, right? At least at the top of the statement, it says bank I don't like.
Right.
Rather than here where you feel like your entire relationship is with, say, a Copper or a Juno or a whatever.
Right, exactly. Well, like I said, I'm going to continue to be reporting on this, and I can't promise I'll be able to dig up all the details behind the scenes. I'm going to do my best, but it really is a sobering example of what can happen when fintech goes wrong. Let's end the show with a little bit more of a lively topic, the startups that might be going public this year. Becca, you did kind of a little deep dive on this. What did you find out?
Yeah, so we're halfway through 2024. Right before the end of 2023, a lot of investors were really hoping the IPO window would open back up this year. And we saw some great IPOs earlier this year. Reddit, Astera Labs, Ibotta, and Rubrik all went public. They are all doing at least okay, if not better. No one is tanking. There's no like $1 penny stock or anything like that. So it definitely seems like the market is receptive right now. But with that being said, a lot of people just do not think we will see a lot of IPOs this year. It's an election year, which traditionally is a slower year. There's a lot of other macro conditions. I've talked to quite a few investors who are just not actually that sure we're out of the woods for a potential recession, which I thought was interesting. So we're looking at the companies that are the big names that everyone thought would go public in 2022, and then we're hopeful in 2023, and now looking in 2024, the names that will just probably not do that this year. And some are very blatant, like you have Plaid. Plaid has even said on stage, not this year. You have other companies where it's a little more murky, like Stripe, Figma, Databricks. Canva also directly said that their IPO would be at least 12 months away a couple of months ago, so definitely 2025, if not later. But it's kind of interesting to speculate, and there's some other little fun nuggets that are not exactly direct symbols that people won't go public this year, but that fall in that category, like Figma and Stripe's huge secondary tender offers for their employees. You typically would not give them that kind of liquidity if you're about to IPO and then give them all this liquidity anyway. But it's been kind of fun to play the guessing game. I will say that my predictions are usually wrong, but I kind of don't think I'm going to be wrong about these ones, at least.
Yeah, I think we started out kind of okay in the beginning of this year, but things are definitely tapering off. I do think the election has a lot to do with that. And as you mentioned, like with Stripe and the secondary sales, definitely don't expect to see them going public this year, as well as Plaid. So I think that a lot of companies are still kind of playing that holding game, and they're just waiting for things to change, waiting for the election to be over. Maybe next year will be like the real turning point in the IPO market.
Marianne, you mentioned the election. Could you connect the dots for me there? I think that's a really interesting point that hadn't actually really occurred to me.
I am not by any means any kind of political expert, but I just feel like there's a lot of uncertainty, right? Anytime there's going to be an election in a country, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to be next. Are we going to get a new president? If we are, what's going to change? And so I think people are kind of like, this is not the best time. It's not the best time to go public because the market could shift dramatically. A new president could try to come in and change things dramatically. So I feel like there's a lot of people holding off until election is over.
Yeah, which is really interesting because this election in particular, well, of course, there are certain issues where if it goes one way or the other, we'll have drastically different outcomes. This area is not really that in this election. I know I'm not the first person who said it. I know I already brought him up, but Dan Primack over at Axios has been saying something kind of similar, where it's like when you look at M&A, you look at IPOs, the two potential candidates this year actually do not have very differing opinions on this area, or don't really have super strong opinions on this area, which of course means they're probably closer aligned than not, which is why it's interesting, because it's like, if it was a really contentious election, financial issues like this were coming up a lot, I would totally understand that. But at this point where I sit, controversial hot take, I think it's being used as an excuse.
Yeah.
More so this time around.
I think that you could very well be right about that. I think, honestly, probably the real truth behind the holding off is just waiting to see other companies do it and how they perform. And I think you could very well be right that they're just sort of hiding behind the election curtain as a reason for not yet going public.
I think we'll see a bunch of companies who maybe already have their S1s in the works or already talking to bankers who are going to file like right after the election. But I do not think it'll be Figma, Plaid, Stripe, Databricks, or Canva.
Nice. There's such a curious thing to me here, which is, startups realistically have two ways of finding liquidity. It's an acquisition or it's an IPO. And for companies who get big enough, there's really only IPOs. At some point, a company gets so big that realistically nobody else can buy them because it's just so much money, so much risk. And this whole liquidity piece is playing into the conversation we had at our Wednesday episode too about the Series A crunch, right? Like the investors, especially the later stage investors now, there's a lot of dry powder going around, but they still have to choose pretty selectively. It's like, hey, these are the companies we're going to back, and these are the ones we're just going to let be zombie companies or die on the vine or what have you.
Yeah.
And I think unless we start seeing some returns, unless we start seeing some IPO activity happening, I think it's going to get harder and harder to be a later stage company.
Yeah, you read my mind. I do think that this is going to continue to impact just the whole investment landscape. I think startups, earlier stage, mid, later, are all going to be impacted by this because these VCs, LPs are not getting their returns yet, not getting that liquidity. They're not seeing the returns. So they're a lot less hesitant maybe to deploy capital. So this is having a ripple effect all over. And we haven't been seeing as much M&A activity either, but that's a whole other topic. So, oh my gosh, I love when we have so much fun and interesting things that we just can't shut up. But we do have to. We're going to have to leave it there. But never fear, Equity will be back on Monday. Until then, you can find me on X at Bay Area Writer and Equity under the handle EquityPod on X and Threads. And don't forget to check out our sister show Found, which dives deep into the stories behind startups with the founders who built them. And Becca co-hosts that. Until then, hope you have a great weekend. Bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.